Okay, so by this point in the Feudalism Nearpod, you've learned about how a great civilization, or you've learned that our essential question is, how does a great civilization rebuild itself after a collapse? And you've explored that every society is a hierarchy, and you looked at our hierarchy here at the school, and you probably drew something with Mr. Yan at the top, and the teachers in the middle, and the staff at the bottom. If you're at this video and your partner next to you is spending 10 minutes on drawing, why don't you tap them on the shoulder and let them know that Mr. Natal said they should hurry up to the next slide. But you have that hierarchy. You got Mr. Yan at the top, the teachers in the middle, the students at the bottom. Ancient Rome, our last unit, was also a hierarchy too. The emperor was on top. The patricians that served in government, the rich noble class were next, and then plebeians, and then there was actually foreigners, and then slaves at the bottom. So that was their hierarchy, and you looked at hierarchies last year with India and China and the caste system and things like that. And then you wrote down the definition of feudalism, which is a system of land ownership in exchange for military service and support. And I want to draw your attention to this. Everyone gets something in the system. So you are to be taking notes on this graphic organizer. So have that out next to you and have your pencil ready because we're going to go pretty quick. However, remember, you can stop and rewind as needed. I do love that about these videos, that you can take your time at your pace. Just trying to play with the camera there. I'm sorry if I'm gone now from your screen, but that's okay. We're looking at how does the interdependence of the feudal system define life in medieval Europe. And interdependence means we're each dependent upon each other. We're not independent, but interdependent. So we do depend on each other. And in the structure of feudalism, it was a hierarchy, but it's not like the people at the top only got served. You can see there's arrows both going up and down. So you provide loyalty and aid to the people above you, and in exchange, you're given land and shelter and protection. I know you're thinking like, well, how are you able to provide them protection to the people below you when they're providing you the military service? Well, in other words, if one of my small lords was in trouble with foreign invaders, I could get my other lords here to send me up their troops, and then I would send those troops to help that lord. That's how your higher-ups can provide land, shelter, and protection. So starting with the king, at the top of your pyramid, you should write that the king is the ruler of the kingdom. And he's going to receive taxes and military service from his lords. The lords will collect it from the peasants. The king will provide to the lords law and order, protection, land, etc. All the things they need to serve their lord. So this is how you should fill out the chart then. The king at the top is the ruler of the kingdom. And everyone is going to pay up taxes, crops, and military services. So you are receiving those things at the top. You're providing them from the bottom. From the top, you provide law and order, protection, and land to the people below you. In the middle of the pyramid, you have your nobles. And what's confusing is that nobles can be lords and vassals at the same time. But if that makes sense if you look at the chart in the background. If you're in the middle here, you are a noble. You're a lord to the people below you, your knights, but you're a vassal to the king. So a vassal is a noble who served a lord of higher rank in return for protection. And there's a very public ceremony where your families are wedded together to keep the faith and loyalty. This was considered more serious than a marriage too. Even though it's between two men, usually, the men are pledging that their families will be wedded together for generations to come. Whereas in a wedding, it's just you and that one person, and you do wed the families together in some sense. But it's really for that generation, maybe the next. But this is for the next several hundred years, all of your great-grandsons will serve my great-grandsons. That's the idea. So it's a very solemn ceremony, a wedding. A vassal would show loyalty by showing up when called upon, serving in the Lord's army. And in return, the vassal was granted land that they could put their peasants on and have them farm. The people who lived on it would farm and provide taxes to their lord. in the form of crops. Okay, the land that the Lord's granted is called a fief. So a fief is the land granted to a vassal. So if you're updating your notes, it should look like this now. A noble served a lord of higher rank in return for protection, and a fief is the land granted to a vassal. Again, they're receiving taxes and service now from their knights, and they're providing law, order, protection, and land to their knights. So who are knights? We'll have a whole lesson on knights coming up, but in general, to introduce them, they're vassals as well. They're lower lords, not as powerful. They would be towards the bottom of this middle. And knights in medieval Europe are very skilled warriors that fought in armor and on horseback. It is extremely expensive to afford all of that armor for yourself and your horse. You usually had to be a noble to afford to be a knight. You usually had to inherit all of that armor and the armor for your horse and your lances and your sword and your bow and so on and so on. There were so many things that it was so expensive that usually the only way you could afford it is if you inherited it. The other thing is you could start out low as a man-at-arms, and as you fought through many medieval battles, each battle there's some dead people left behind. You could hopefully claim some of the armor, some of the weapons, and over time be able to kit yourself better and better. They were considered the tanks of medieval Europe. Nothing could withstand a charge of heavy armored horse other than other heavy armored horses charging back at you. And for several hundred years, that was the way of it. Every time the horses charged, that was the decisive moment of the battle. Nothing could really stop it. When we get to the end of the unit, I'll talk to you about what eventually did stop it. Knights are the rulers of a small fief, and they get taxes and service from their peasants and serfs, and they provide to their peasants and serfs law and order, protection, and land. So as you're updating your chart, it should look like this now. Knights are warriors in armor who fought on horseback. Knights were vassals too. Finally, the peasants at the bottom work in the fields, they pay their taxes, and they receive protection and land to farm. Now, serfs were not allowed to leave the land. When the land was sold or inherited by somebody else, you inherited the land, the cattle, the barns, the stables, and the serfs, just like they were property. Peasants, on the other hand, rented the land. They were technically free and they could move around and go somewhere else, whereas serfs were tied to the land. They could not leave. Now, there were several problems with feudalism. You should write these down at the bottom of your paper. Power was too spread out. As a king, I would appoint each of you at a different table group to be a lord, and each of you would have different duties and responsibilities, but that also would give you power. And so it'd be easier for the 7 of you to bond together and overthrow me, or 3 or 4 of you could gain too much power and decide you're going to break away and form your own kingdom. And so over time, weak leaders might be ignored by their servants, the people that are supposed to be sending them an army, might just not do it. Especially with a castle, you could hide away in your big, strong castle and refuse your king. So weak leaders might get ignored or overthrown over time. Nobles, too, initially would be very loyal to their king. They rode into battle together, they fought and won this kingdom from the Romans together, and so they'd be very loyal to each other. They were kind of like biker gangs, but they were on horseback. Now, that's a great deal of loyalty. It will strongly keep you together fighting through battles and whatnot. But what about 10 years from now? What about 100 years from now, when your great-grandkids are being served by their great-grandkids? Are the great-grandkids of gang members going to be loyal to the great-granddaddy's son, great-grandson of the original gang leader? I doubt it, right? After many generations, there's nothing tying them together. They didn't ride into battle together. Their great-grandfathers rode into battle together. Who cares? If you're a young lord looking to make your money and somebody's demanding taxes from you, you might be tempted to overthrow them and not pay those taxes. That's one problem with feudalism. Another problem. Overtaxation was another problem. At this time, you were expected to give 2/3 of your fields in taxes to your lord. So you would work 3 fields, but 2 of the fields, everything you grew, you would give to your lord. Guys, that's 66% taxes. Your parents and I complain about spending 25 to 30% of our income on taxes. 66% would cause a national revolt. It's terrible, it's horrible, but at that time, it was considered necessary to stay alive. So people would be willing to spend it because they had no other option. Whereas today, things are safer, more productive. We have more abundance, so we're less likely to accept 66% taxes. But back then, that was acceptable, that was necessary. Now, the problem with feudalism, too, is that because it's hard to collect taxes and because nobles have less and less loyalty and weak leaders find it hard to rule, and so much power is dispersed or shared among so many people. Instead of one teacher, there would be 7 of you in the room plus me, right? That's a lot of power sharing. It'd be harder for me to organize you. It'd be harder for me to convince you to pay for things like fleets and harbors and roads and bridges that our kingdom needs when you all have a say in it. And finally, the last problem was primogeniture. And this should also be written down and highlighted and underlined because this will be on your quiz. Primogeniture is a concept where the firstborn son inherits everything from their family. The land, the house, the castle, the army, their titles, which is what the army serves as your title, and the wealth of their family. And so if you were a woman, a young lady, your job would be a princess. You would be to be married to someone else, to add to the family's wealth through marriage and alliance. You would not inherit anything from your family. So once your family dies, you would really need a husband to take care of you or an older brother. The eldest brother, right? The firstborn son. Your second and thirdborn and fourth and fifthborn sons would inherit nothing, which led many of them to need some other option, some answer to what are these people going to do? And there was 2 options for you. You could either become a knight and serve a lord, and you would get some land and some wealth that way, but it would be a lower title than probably your family held on its own. And then the other option is that you could become a member of the church, the Catholic Church, the clergy. And you would get an education there and a career. However, that meant you would have to give up any future family. You're not going to get married, you're not going to have kids, etc. That would be very convenient for your older brother who might be worried that you would one day overthrow him. So these are the problems with feudalism. You can check out more of the problems on page 532 of your textbooks and update your list as needed, but I'm happy with you having the negative aspects, just the problems with feudalism. From this point on, you can continue on with the Nearpod. I look forward to seeing you back in class next week.